Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the Y Factor on 87.6 FM. It's Tasneem here on the mic and I'm joined by Ustath Nurudeen Lemu all the way from Nigeria. Alhamdulillah, he's been in Sydney for the last couple of days and he's been addressing some pertinent topics to Muslims globally. And we did attend his Train the Trainers course, which was amazing, and a big shout out. So inshallah next time he's in town you must all catch it. Now today I thought I'd catch up with him inshallah and have a chat about some of the pertinent topics, especially in relation to our Y Factor group and all the heated discussions we have on there, and generally the etiquette of discussion around Islamic topics and topics generally when we are trying to seek, I guess, an ultimate truth or even a search for meaning. So Ustath Nur, when we are talking about the Islamic worldview or the Islamic system and the way it views issues or concerns, often we get stuck in an apologetic or a dogmatic stance of black and white, this is Islam, this is not Islam. How do we actually reinvigorate the search for normative and moral values? So Islam as a religion, as a way of life, has these moral codes and moral values and normative stances that it goes back on. How do we reinvigorate that and kind of get out of the discourse which is kind of, black and white and dogmatic?
A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Something that is generally missing in the understanding of most Muslims' understanding of Islam is the maqasid, the objectives, the higher intents of what Sharia is out to achieve. Basically the qibla of actions. And people easily get into doing things without knowing what ultimately is supposed to come out of it, and without realizing that, as the Prophet said, the best among you is he who is most useful to others. A very unfortunate side of the teaching and instruction about Islam is the tradition of memorizing, of not asking why, of thinking that trying to dig into the wisdom is a form of disrespect, that asking questions is to some extent a bit heretical, or that trying to appreciate why Allah said certain things or why the Prophet encouraged us or commanded us to do certain things is a form of rebellion or an expression of our doubt. It is important to remember that as pure as angels are, Allah makes it clear in the Quran that even angels asked questions. The angels asked, why, Allah, would you create on earth one who would shed blood and cause corruption? And one thing to understand therefore is there's nothing wrong in asking questions. The key thing is for us to know how to answer people who ask questions. Of course, we should try and make our questions meaningful and point it towards things that are useful, but to at least open the door for debate, for discussions. We live in times now when everything comes under question. At some time, nobody really cared to ask whether there was God or not. How are you sure Quran is the word of Allah? Are these hadiths strong or weak? Most people, most lay people just carried on with Islam. Now we live in a more globalized society, which is a marketplace of ideas, and people are asking questions, and it has become necessary for us to rejuvenate. This is, long overdue, but to revitalize the sciences that looked at the hikmah, looked at the wisdom behind Islamic injunctions. Because once we can tie Islamic injunctions to the ends, to the objectives they are supposed to achieve, we appreciate them better and we appreciate the context in which they applied. The big problem is when we take instructions out of context and they become meaningless, and when people prove to us they are meaningless, we get defensive. Instead of us digging to find meaning in a more civilized environment, we wait until it becomes a debate, and then it easily hurts egos and leads to disunity.
I think the problem also stems from the fact that often the ahkam or the rules and commandments are actually confused with sharia itself, or we see sharia as haram and halal rather than sharia as a process or a methodology or even an overall morality that we look back to, some sort of compass that should guide the ahkam or the rules and the commandments. So I guess that brings me to my next question. If we view sharia in this way as a process, as a methodology or an overall morality, how do we reinstill the ethos or the Islamic ethos into our life? So that way when we are looking at, for example, ahkams or commandments, it doesn't become black and white for us, but rather we reinvigorate the spirit of Islam into our lives through viewing Islam as a process, as an ethos, as some sort of overall moral code.
Firstly, Sharia refers to the way of life that is prescribed by the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet, peace be upon him. Those are eternally relevant. Sharia involves ibadah and aqidah and mu'amalat. In other words, it takes on every aspect of life. The creed, which we call aqidah, the acts of worship and devotion to God, which we call ibadat, and those social transactions, the interpersonal relations like the economy and education, healthcare, politics, and all the other aspects of life that we spend most of our time engaged in. So Sharia refers to all that is contained in the Quran and the Sunnah, its direction, its objectives. Jurisprudence or fiqh or law is what the scholar approaches the Quran and derives laws. They do what is called istinbat, which is the extraction of laws from the Quran and the Sunnah to suit the context they live in. And that is why the fiqh that would be applied in one context is not always identical to another, because contexts were different. That's why scholars would hold one fatwa in one place but change it over time or change it with differing locations. So if you took the metaphor of a tree, the roots would be the Quran and the Sunnah, and the fruits and leaves which change with the seasons are what we call the fatwa or the fiqh. And the trunk and branches are those branches and equations of usulul fiqh and maqasid through which scholars extract rulings for their respective communities. It does become a problem when people start treating fiqh as being sharia. Yes, there are some very clear do's and don'ts that are directly from the Quran and the Sunnah. We are clearly prohibited from shirk. We are clearly prohibited from drinking alcohol. We are clearly instructed to pray. There are some black and whites, but a lot of the things that we are required to do are means towards achieving the grand objectives, the higher intents, the maqasid of Sharia. And what is important is for Muslim, and especially Muslim youth, but it's everybody, to appreciate while you will not challenge the Quran or the Sunnah, you will challenge people's interpretation. You will challenge fiqh based on the methodology and the tools used by scholars, and to decide whether a particular fruit belongs to the season or not, and whether a particular fatwa has been made out of context or is unrealistic. It may make problems worse. That fiqh is a result of human effort. Sharia is divine. Sharia is part of what is eternal. We will always have the Quran and the Sunnah and that way of life, from which every generation will extract rulings, would redo the tafsir of the Quran, would look at the commentaries on the hadith again, and come out with new rulings for changing circumstances. So one big problem is when we fail to appreciate the distinction between the two, and when people start questioning why did this scholar say so, we say, oh, it's Sharia, and start treating fiqh, or law, which is the job of scholars to extract, as if that was some unquestionable authority. We should always keep questioning, otherwise a fruit misses the season, but we still want to insist everybody should eat that fruit. So it's for us to keep alert and continue asking ourselves, the whole morality, the ethos, the ethics, the objectives objectives, the protection of justice and mercy and compassion, the protection of family and life and all that Sharia stands for, is fiqh still achieving that? And if it's not, to get the scholars, not ignorant people, to get scholars to rethink and come up with new rulings that are more relevant to the lives of community and of Muslims.
In an age of, I guess, internet activism, social media, Google fatwas, things like that, often it becomes that it's actually strict adherence to rules, or fiqh, if you want to put it that way, without, I guess, appreciating the meaning, the context, or even the relevance, becomes a yardstick for measuring someone's piety. So piety becomes conflated with strict adherence to any sort of fiqh, and it's often a black and white view of what the person thinks the correct fiqh is. And it doesn't become the other way around, whereas when someone is infused with piety, that naturally dictates how they view, the rules or the ahkam of Islam. So how do we make, and this is something very pertinent to young people who do get passionate about their religion, they want to get back on the right track, but often confuse this thing, if you want to be pious, stick to the black and white and it has to be this way or the highway, or rather, how do we actually get back to have the taqwa, to have the piety, and then we have the system of taqwa in our body as a compass, I guess, that guides us towards doing the right and the wrong anyway. So I guess that this is more for the young people. How do we draw that fine line between, I'm going to follow a book form of what is considered to be taqwa, rather than how do I instill the compass taqwa in me so that guides me?
Generally, to avoid the problem of a fuzzy idea of an internal compass that guides, the scholars have tried to articulate the spirit of Sharia. In other words, what Sharia is supposed to achieve, the purpose, the wisdom, the higher objectives. And that is what the maqasid of Sharia is all about. The letter of the law should also be respected. And Imam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, I think, gave a beautiful analogy of the relationship between our reasoning faculties and revelation, where he said the relationship between reasoning and revelation is similar to the relationship between the eyes and light. That to follow revelation without reasoning is like moving around in daylight but with your eyes shut. But also to say you're going to go with reasoning without revelation is like moving around with your eyes open but in the dark. In other words, the two are necessary. And the methodology of juristic reasoning, which is called the methodology of ijtihad, which is what usulul fiqh and the whole field of maqasid is all about, is to have a balanced approach towards the letter and the spirit, towards what appears to be black and white and the attainment of the objectives of the black and white. And if the black and white appears not to be achieving its objectives, then to relook the interpretation of the black and white, because the interpretation of the Quran and the Sunnah, except where it was clearly made by the Prophet ﷺ, is open for people to look again. And that's why you can never have a final tafsir of the Quran. Every generation will come up with scholars that look at the Quran, look at the Sunnah, and keep the relevance alive. So, I think the role of taqwa, we always remember, and this is the first hadith in Sahih Bukhari, it is also the first maxim in Sharia that scholars quote, which is tied to the hadith where the Prophet ﷺ said, actions are judged by their intentions. Or in the field of maqasid, they say, al-umur bi maqasidiha, that affairs are judged according to the intents and the objectives behind them. So the question of objectives, we should always stand by. And it's difficult to talk of taqwa as being a compass. Taqwa increases our sensitivity to right and wrong. But you can have high taqwa, but you're very ignorant, and you could misguide. So, strong taqwa should at the same time be infused with humility and curiosity to learn more and to recognize those who know more. But if something really pinches your conscience, if something is clearly not achieving the objectives of Sharia, then scholars like Imam Shatibi, Izzuddin bin Abdus, all the great scholars who spent a lot of time on the articulation of the objectives of Sharia would say, if something is creating cruelty, if something is creating injustice, if something is moving away from wisdom to folly, moving away from the common good to harm, then it does not belong to Sharia, irrespective of your interpretation. And so a person with taqwa should be conscious that if a fatwa is creating problems, then whichever process was used to come to that fatwa, which is a human effort, must be creating problems. Even where, as we see in the life of Umar bin Khattab, there's a clear injunction in the Quran about amputating the hand of a thief, where Umar bin Khattab as Caliph recognized that due to famine, it was the poor that will be punished for theft. He suspended the punishment, even though it's clearly in the Quran. Why? Because it would not be achieving its objectives. And so we should always be attuned to the harmony between the letter of the law and the spirit, the black and white and the objectives that are themselves black and white. Justice is a black and white objective. So any interpretation that goes against the objectives should be re-questioned again. So it's not asking people to go and do self-medication, but ask another scholar for their own opinion.
Well, to wrap it up, and speaking of scholars and pursuing knowledge and things like that, for our listeners who want to kind of think, okay, where's the next step? So where do I go from here to actually get a further understanding of the classical scholarship in this field, whether it be the maqasid, whether it be usul al-fiqh, jurisprudence and things like that? Recommendations for further knowledge, references, where does a young seeker start?
Firstly, it's important to remember that just as in science, when you come to measure weights, there was a time when people weighed things in ounces and in stones, and gradually they refined their methods to weigh kilograms and grams, and then gradually they started going into milligrams, and I think nanograms and or micrograms. The equipment got more and more sensitive. It improved with generations. What scholars of the various schools of thought did was to make contributions to the tools and equipment that the scholars of that particular school were using. It is not proper to say that today we are going to jump over 1,000 years of contributions to Islamic scholarship and go back and do things as they are in the Muwatta of Malik or of Shaybani, or to go back to the Risala of Shafi, etc. But to look at all the positive contributions that the scholars of the various schools have made to their schools. And so I would say that the most relevant scholars to Muslims today are contemporary scholars who have studied what past scholars have said and have represented what really matters to present generation. And in that regard, it starts becoming necessary for us to ask ourselves, which fields within the Islamic sciences are we interested in studying? If you're interested in studying things by hadith scholars, then in what language would you like to learn these subjects? And to what level of proficiency? If you want to go to the highest levels of proficiency, then you would have to go and look into some of the Arabic literature in this area. If, however, you want an intermediate level or a beginner's level, there are a lot of very good books on the sciences of hadith by Mustafa Azami, by Muhammad Hashim Kamali, by somebody Siddiq. There are a number of very good books in the Ulumul Hadith and in the Ulumul Quran. Ahmad van Denfa wrote a very good book. There are a number of good books that keep coming out. The Islamic Foundation has done some good work in this area. If you are interested in the process of fatwa giving and how ijtihad takes place and how scholars come to conclude or disagree legitimately on certain issues, then you would have to start reading books related to usulul fiqh and maqasid. And there's some very good books in this area in English also. For a beginner, you have books like Tariq Ramadan's book, To Be a European Muslim, who has a very good simple chapter on that. Akram Khan Laldeen has a book on the principles and objectives of Sharia, which is very good, an introduction for that. A more intermediate book would be Hashim Kamali's book. Actually, it's quite advanced, I would say. But Hashim Kamali's book on principles of Islamic jurisprudence, which is probably the best book in English on the subject area. Tariq Ramadan's book Radical Reform has a very good chapter, very good in the area of application. Jasir Auda has a very good book on the maqasid of Sharia, and he goes into usul he gives a whole chapter to the classical methods and suggestions that have been put forward by past and contemporary scholars to the classical approach towards legal theory. The IIIT, the International Institute of Islamic Thought, has come up with quite a number of books on this subject area of usul and maqasid. And it's important to remember, if anybody is to want to start assessing the views of scholars, if they don't have a good grounding in usulul fiqh and maqasid, such people are potentially dangerous, because they start giving opinions in fields that are outside their specializations. It was muftis and mujtahids that classically gave fatwas. Muhaddith were not muftis. Muhaddith were scholars who would decide on the strength and authenticity of hadith. Tafsir scholars would comment on the meaning and commentary and exegesis of the Quran. Muftis and mujtahids would deal with fiqh and fatwa. Fuqaha would to some extent be in that area. So there are a lot of good books out there that one would find useful. There's some websites that are coming out dealing with maqasid sharia, and I think the more Muslims get attuned to these subject areas, particularly the maqasid as developed particularly after scholars like Imam Shatibi, you find congregating of scholars around maqasid. When great scholars today like Yusuf al-Qaradawi, Jabir al-Wani, Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya, a number of these scholars who have good grounding in usulul fiqh, when they start answering questions, you find they are not answering according to just one madhab. They give the opinion of any madhab that best achieves the maqasid of Sharia, because there's less disunity in the field of maqasid than there is in the area of usul and that area. So I think there's good websites of Jasir Auda and Tariq Ramadan who speak a lot on this area. Hamza Yusuf had Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya do a number of courses in usulul fiqh. The Foundations of Our Faith was a good one. Another one that was done was Sacred Law in Secular Land, which was again dealing with fiqh of minorities, but a good grounding in usulul fiqh that I would highly recommend. He did another one on Islamic legal philosophy, excellent subject area, and I think these are easily available and they are more than worth the money for getting them. Allahu alam.
Ustad, thank you so much. I think you've given the youth a lot to mull over summer, so there's no excuses to get your hands on these resources and inshallah start that process for change and start the process to, I guess, get your mind around these concepts. Now, I'm going to give you the final 30 seconds. For those who kind of get into the field, you learn so much, you become so eager, then all of a sudden, overnight, some people think they're mujtahids. Now, in the TTC, you kept mentioning, put your seatbelt on, you know, calm down and chill. Just as a final advice to those who kind of get into the subjects, they become eager, where to in terms of bracing yourself before you launch?
A denominator among all schools of thought and Muslim groups, something they all hold in common, which is usually the basis of Aqidah, also of what makes you a Muslim, is the clear, explicit statements of the Quran or Sunnah mutawatir. In other words, if there is an instruction, a command or a prohibition, a requirement from the Quran that is explicitly clear, it's what they call qat'i, you know, that you are certain about it and it's qat'i dalala, it's clear in its meaning and implications, then we all follow. If it is in Sunnah mutawatir it's referred to by the fuqaha or the field, those in that field as those Sunnah that have so many chains of narrators that it is impossible to fabricate such hadith, they become the basis of Aqidah. And they are different from Sunnah that are Ahad or Khabar Wahid that have less chains. And so the schools of thought differ on the amount of authority. And there's a big debate among scholars, but that's an area where differences begin. So if there is an issue that is not explicitly clear in the Quran or explicitly clear in the Sunnah Mutawatir, the moment you move to Sunnah Ahad or any of the other tools of ijtihad like qiyas or analogy, ijma or consensus, or sometimes it means majority opinion, or sadud daraya and maslaha, public interest, or istihsan, juristic preference, or ra'i of sahaba, the opinion of a sahaba, or urf, or custom, amal ahl al-Madina, the practice of the people of Medina. All these other tools that are used to guide reasoning and ijtihad are tools upon which scholars differ in the authority and the definition. So there's no agreed definition of ijma, or its definition, the meaning, the implication, how binding it is, etc. The same thing with qiyas, they have differences there. And the authority of single chain hadith, scholars differ. Shafi would consider ijma as superior to an ahad hadith. The Hanafis would consider qiyas and ijma and istihsan as superior. The Malikis would consider qiyas, amal of Medina, and maslaha as superior to single chain hadith. So the moment you don't find it explicitly clear in the Quran or Sunnah mutawatir, calm down, because scholars will begin to differ. And let's not allow those differences to lead us to disregard verses in the Quran and in the Sunnah that require us to maintain our brotherhood, maintain our unity and compassion towards each other. In other words, the moment you have crossed that Rubicon of the Quran and the Sunnah mutawatir, then calm down, agree to disagree agreeably. Look at maqasid, but even where you disagree with others, do it respectfully, but don't break the brotherhood. And my advice to anyone, and I say, and I pray Allah continues to help me abide by the same principles, always stay humble, that only Allah knows. Even the greatest of scholars, as certain as they are, like Imam Shafi about his opinion, would say, I believe I'm right with the possibility that I could be wrong. And I believe the other person is wrong with the possibility that he could be right. In other words, don't think you are so right that it's impossible to be wrong. So keep that humility. Stay curious, because there's always something you don't know. We don't say Allahu Alam for no good reason. Let it come from our heart that there are things we don't know, and we should try and learn alternative perspectives, to stay sincere in our commitment to Allah, that is fi sabilillah, not for the sake of our group, not some identity politics, but to please Allah, and to continue to pedal the bicycle of jihad bin nafs, of struggling in being more curious, being more humble, being more sincere and committed to being better Muslims. May Allah continue to forgive us for our lapses.
Jazakallah khair, Ustad, and hopefully those values and those parting words will be, I guess, our foundations for discussions on the Y factor. So inshallah, I hope after our listeners hear this, there'll be a new era in terms of discussions. Thank you so much. We really enjoyed having you in Sydney, and inshallah, anytime you want to make hijrah to Sydney, we're the Ansar and we're ready to take you on. Thank you, and Jazakallah khair, and assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you.